September 17th, 1944, 0340 hours. Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner pressed his eye against the narrow vision slit of Bunker Complex 7, scanning the misty forest line near the Belgian border. His squad of 8 men had held this reinforced position for 3 weeks without incident. In his breast pocket, he carried a photograph of his younger brother Werner, who had written from the Eastern Front describing how German discipline and superior positioning always prevailed against Russian numerical advantage. Klaus had smiled when he read those words, believing the same truth applied to his own situation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Americans lack the stomach for real fighting. They rely on their machines because they have no warrior spirit. Klaus had written these exact words to Werner just 5 days earlier, after observing American patrols through his binoculars. They moved cautiously, almost fearfully, never pressing their advantages. The concrete walls surrounding him were 2 meters thick, the firing apertures perfectly angled to cover the approach roads. Field Marshal von Kluge himself had inspected these fortifications in July, running his hand along the smooth concrete and pronouncing them adequate for the defense of the Reich. Through the observation port, Klaus could see nothing but the gentle swaying of pine trees in the pre-dawn darkness. The forest was silent except for the occasional call of a night bird. Everything appeared peaceful, almost mundane. In 6 hours, this same veteran non-commissioned officer would be the sole survivor of his squad, found by relief forces sitting in shocked silence amid the bodies of his comrades, unable to explain what had happened with any coherence. His after-action report would be so disturbing that division headquarters would initially refuse to believe it, dismissing his account as combat hysteria until physical evidence forced them to accept the impossible. Though Brenner would later insist that a single American weapon had killed 7 of his 8-man squad in less than 10 seconds, military analysts struggled to reconcile this claim with their understanding of small arms capabilities. The mathematics of American firepower were about to be written not in training manuals or tactical assessments, but in the traumatized testimony of a soldier who witnessed his entire world collapse in the time it takes to draw 3 breaths. The West Wall, which the Allies called the Siegfried Line, stretched nearly 600 kilometers from the Netherlands to Switzerland. German engineers had constructed over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, creating what propaganda called an impenetrable barrier against Western invasion. After the disaster in France, these fortifications represented Germany's last prepared defensive line, the final shield protecting the fatherland itself. Along the Belgian-German border, the defensive works appeared particularly formidable. Military historians note that the bunkers in this sector had been constructed between 1938 and 1940, using the most advanced defensive architecture available. Each position was designed to support its neighbors, creating interlocking fields of fire that theoretically made approach suicidal for any attacking force. Bunker Complex 7, Klaus Brenner's position, exemplified this defensive philosophy. The structure contained 3 interconnected chambers, 2 firing positions with overlapping coverage, reinforced ammunition storage, and a protected entrance angled to prevent direct fire penetration. The main firing chamber held 2 MG-42 machine guns on fixed mounts, with calculated fields of fire that covered both approach roads and the forest clearing. The bunker's designer, Major Wilhelm Eckhardt of the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps, had calculated every angle with mathematical precision. His specifications called for walls thick enough to withstand 155 mm artillery strikes, firing ports narrow enough to prevent grenade entry, and internal compartments that would contain any explosion. The bunker could theoretically hold out for weeks against conventional assault supplied through underground tunnels connecting to rear positions. Brenner's squad represented typical Wehrmacht infantry of late 1944. He himself was 26 years old, a veteran of the French campaign and garrison duty in Norway. His experience made him the anchor of a squad otherwise composed of younger soldiers, some barely 19. Gefreiter Hans Wolf, his second in command, had turned 21 just 3 days earlier. The youngest, Schütze Paul Richter, was 18 and had been with the squad for only 5 weeks. Despite their varying experience levels, all had received the same training in bunker defense. They knew their firing lanes, understood the procedure for ammunition management, and had practiced the coordinated fire patterns that would theoretically shred any infantry assault. The MG-42 machine guns gave them overwhelming firepower at ranges up to 800 meters. Nothing in their training suggested that American infantry weapons could threaten a properly defended bunker position. September 16th had passed with unusual quiet. American artillery, which had been steadily pounding German positions for weeks, had fallen silent around noon. This silence troubled Brenner more than the bombardment had. Artillery preparation meant the Americans were softening positions from a distance. Silence meant they might be preparing to close the distance. At evening briefing, Hauptmann Fritz Keller, their company commander, had addressed the entire defensive sector. His message was simple and direct. The Americans are probing for weaknesses. Every bunker must hold its position. Any retreat without orders will be treated as desertion. The implication was clear and terrifying. German military law prescribed execution for abandoning defensive positions. Keller had also shared intelligence assessments that painted American infantry as over-reliant on artillery and air support. Without these advantages, the intelligence briefing suggested American soldiers were poorly motivated and inadequately trained. The briefing specifically mentioned that American automatic weapons, while numerous, lacked the range and penetration to threaten fortified positions. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The night watch rotation placed Brenner at the primary observation post from 0300 to 0600 hours. Beside him, Wolf manned the ready machine gun, while the rest of the squad rested in the rear chamber. Standard procedure called for 2 men alert at all times, with the others ready to respond within seconds. The arrangement had worked perfectly for 3 weeks through numerous American probing attacks that had been easily repulsed. At 0410 hours, Brenner detected movement in the tree line 400 meters distant. Nothing dramatic, just the subtle displacement of shadows that might indicate human presence. He alerted Wolf with a hand gesture, and both men focused their attention on the suspected area. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then, gradually, they began to perceive shapes moving through the forest with careful deliberation. The movement pattern was different from previous American patrols. These soldiers advanced in short rushes, using terrain expertly, always maintaining cover. Brenner counted at least 12 figures, possibly more, moving in 2 distinct groups. Their discipline impressed him despite his trained contempt for American fighting ability. These men knew what they were doing. Brenner faced a tactical decision. He could open fire immediately, catching the Americans in the open and likely inflicting heavy casualties. However, this would reveal his position and might be premature if this was merely a reconnaissance patrol. The alternative was to wait, letting the Americans close the distance while maintaining the element of surprise. His training emphasized patience. Let the enemy commit fully before revealing your strength. He chose to wait, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Americans continued their approach, moving with admirable caution. By 0430, they had closed to within 250 meters, well within the killing zone of his machine guns. Brenner prepared to give the fire command, his hand on Wolf's shoulder, ready to squeeze and trigger the ambush. Then something changed. The American movement suddenly stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, the forest became completely still. Brenner felt his heart rate increase, wondering if they had been detected. Then, with shocking speed, the Americans rushed forward in a coordinated assault that caught him completely off guard. The assault began with smoke grenades that erupted across the approach zone, instantly obscuring Brenner's carefully calculated fields of fire. Within seconds, thick white smoke transformed the killing ground into a blank wall of obscurity. This was not the tentative, poorly coordinated American attack that intelligence briefings had described. This was professional infantry work executed with precision that rivaled German assault tactics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Brenner shouted for Wolf to open fire, and the MG-42 roared to life, spewing rounds at 1,200 per minute into the smoke. The weapon's distinctive sound, like tearing cloth amplified 1,000 times, echoed across the forest. Brenner could see tracers disappearing into the white cloud, but had no idea if they were hitting anything. Doctrine called for firing in traversing patterns to cover the entire approach zone, and Wolf executed this perfectly, sweeping the gun back and forth. The rear squad members tumbled out of their rest area, moving to their battle positions with practiced efficiency. Gefreiter Ludwig Stein took position at the secondary firing port with the backup MG-42. Schütze Martin Koch readied ammunition belts, prepared to feed the hungry machine guns. The bunker transformed from a sleeping garrison to a fighting position in under 15 seconds, exactly as training prescribed. For perhaps 2 minutes, both machine guns hammered away at the smoke, expending ammunition at a prodigious rate. The sound inside the bunker was deafening despite the protective concrete. Empty shell casings piled up on the floor, bouncing and rolling with metallic clinks. The smell of gunpowder grew thick and acrid. This was exactly what they had trained for, the kind of defensive fire that should stop any infantry assault cold. Then, through a gap in the smoke, Brenner glimpsed American soldiers much closer than should have been possible. They had used the smoke and the terrain to advance to within 100 meters, using dead ground that Brenner had not adequately accounted for. His stomach tightened with the first touch of real fear. These were not the clumsy, road-bound Americans of the intelligence briefings. These men understood terrain and tactical movement. He was about to order concentrated fire on the new position when he saw something that made no tactical sense. A single American soldier stood up from cover, clearly visible for a moment. The man carried a weapon Brenner did not recognize, something between a rifle and a machine gun. Before Brenner could process what he was seeing, the American began firing. The sound was different from anything Brenner had heard before. Not the high-pitched crack of rifles, not the ripping cloth sound of the MG-42, but a deeper, rhythmic hammering. The weapon fired rapidly, but with a controlled, almost mechanical cadence. And the rounds were hitting the bunker with tremendous force, creating impacts that sent concrete dust puffing from around the firing ports. What happened next would later be described by ballistics experts as a confluence of tragic circumstances, though to Brenner it seemed like dark sorcery. The American weapon, firing .30-06 Springfield rounds at approximately 500 rounds per minute, found the exact angle where Bunker Complex 7's firing port offered minimal protection. The bunker's design, so carefully calculated by Major Eckhart, had one critical flaw that existed only at specific angles. The primary firing port, designed to deflect rounds coming from frontal assault, was vulnerable to fire coming from approximately 30 degrees off-center at ranges under 150 meters. At this angle, the protective concrete overhang actually channeled incoming rounds directly into the aperture rather than deflecting them. The American soldier, either through incredible luck or professional expertise that Brenner could not fathom, had positioned himself at precisely this angle. When he opened fire, his rounds did not deflect off the concrete as they should have. Instead, they poured directly through the 18-inch wide firing port in a sustained stream. Gefreiter Hans Wolf, positioned directly behind the MG-42, took the first burst across his upper chest and throat. The .30-06 rounds, heavy and powerful, struck with devastating effect at close range. Wolf made a gurgling sound and fell backward, his hands clutching at wounds that were already fatal. He would be dead within 30 seconds, though Brenner did not know this yet. The rounds continued pouring through the aperture, ricocheting off the interior concrete walls at angles that turned the bunker's interior into a death trap. What had been their protection became a killing chamber. Schütze Paul Richter, the 18-year-old replacement, was struck in the head by a ricocheting round and killed instantly. Obergefreiter Thomas Meyer, moving forward with an ammunition belt, took rounds in the abdomen and collapsed. The American weapon fired in a sustained burst that lasted approximately 6 to 8 seconds, though to Brenner it seemed both instantaneous and eternal. In that brief span, 7 of his 8-man squad were hit by direct fire or ricochets. The mathematical improbability of this outcome would later be discussed in Wehrmacht tactical assessment meetings. One weapon firing through a narrow aperture, achieving a casualty rate that seemed to violate the basic principles of ballistics. Brenner himself was spared only because he had been standing slightly to the left of the primary firing port, in a position where the concrete provided genuine protection. He watched in paralyzed horror as his squad was cut down in seconds. Men he had served with for months, who had shared rations and complaints and hopes of survival, were suddenly dying around him in a concrete box that had promised safety. The firing stopped. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. Brenner's ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Smoke from the machine guns mixed with concrete dust and the copper smell of blood. His mind struggled to process what had just happened, refusing to accept the evidence his eyes provided. Gefreiter Ludwig Stein was still alive, gasping with a sucking chest wound that bubbled with each breath. Schütze Martin Koch moaned softly, conscious but badly wounded. The others were clearly dead or dying, their bodies in positions no living person would naturally assume. 7 men hit in less than 10 seconds. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Brenner's training screamed at him to return fire, to man the machine guns, to defend the position. But both gunners were down, and the firing port that had seemed like security now appears as a portal through which death could pour at any moment. His hands shook as he pulled his Kar 98 rifle to his shoulder, knowing it was inadequate, knowing everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Outside, he could hear American voices calling to each other, coordinating their next move. They knew they had scored a devastating hit. They were preparing to finish what they had started. Brenner looked at the heavy steel door that sealed the bunker's entrance, knowing it would not hold forever. He looked at his dying men, at the blood spreading across the concrete floor, at the empty shell casings from the machine guns that had fired confidently just minutes before. The mathematics that had promised German victory, the careful calculations of fields of fire and protective concrete, had encountered a reality they had not accounted for. One American weapon, in the hands of a soldier who understood angles and opportunity, had turned an impregnable defensive position into a tomb. The walls that were supposed to protect had contained and multiplied the killing effect of incoming fire. Klaus Brenner had begun this morning believing in German tactical superiority and the strength of prepared defenses. Now he crouched in the ruins of those beliefs, surrounded by evidence that everything he had been taught was wrong. The Americans did not lack fighting spirit. They had simply industrialized killing to a degree that made individual courage and defensive engineering equally irrelevant. The weapon that had destroyed his squad was the Browning automatic rifle, the Bar, a piece of military equipment that would become legendary for exactly this kind of devastating effectiveness. Firing .30-06 rounds at a rate that balanced firepower with control, it gave American infantry squads a level of mobile automatic fire that German tactics had not adequately accounted for. But Brenner knew none of this technical information. All he knew was that his world had ended in the time it takes to count to 8, that his squad was gone, and that the confident letter he had written to his brother 5 days ago now seemed like the words of a fool who had no understanding of what modern warfare had become. The morning was just beginning, and already he had learned that survival was not about fighting spirit or concrete walls. It was about not being in the path of industrial violence when it decided to express itself. The smoke outside the bunker began to dissipate as dawn light filtered through the forest canopy. Brenner remained frozen in his position, his rifle aimed at the firing port that had transformed from protective advantage to fatal weakness. His mind raced through tactical options, each one seeming more futile than the last. The primary machine gun was silent, its operator dead on the floor. The secondary weapon might still function, but reaching it meant exposing himself to that devastating American firepower. Stein's breathing had become shallow and irregular, each breath a wet rattle that Brenner recognized from previous combat. The man was drowning in his own blood, and there was nothing anyone could do. Shoots of coke had gone silent, and Brenner could not tell if he had lost consciousness or died. The other 5 members of his squad were unquestionably dead, their bodies sprawled in positions that spoke of sudden, violent termination. American voices grew louder outside, coordinated and professional. Brenner heard what sounded like orders being given, movements being coordinated. They were preparing for the final assault, the breach that would finish what their automatic rifle had started. His hands trembled as he maintained his aim, knowing that his bolt-action rifle represented laughably inadequate defense against what was coming. The tactical situation was clear to anyone with military training. The bunker's heavy door could withstand small arms fire, but the Americans would have satchel charges or Bangalore torpedoes designed specifically for breaching fortifications. Once that door was blown, the cramped interior would become a slaughter pen. Brenner's only rational choice was immediate surrender, throwing his weapon aside and hoping the Americans took prisoners rather than finishing wounded Germans. But surrender meant court-martial if he somehow survived the war. German military justice showed no mercy to those who abandoned defensive positions, regardless of circumstances. Hauptmann Keller's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. Any retreat without orders will be treated as desertion. The penalty for desertion was execution. Brenner was trapped between American firepower on one side and German military law on the other. A new sound reached his ears, something that made his tactical assessment even more desperate. The distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles, growing louder as they approached through the forest. American armor was moving up to support the infantry assault. Brenner's bunker, designed to withstand infantry attack, had no anti-tank capability. The walls that were 2 meters thick might resist small arms, but tank guns would reduce the structure to rubble. Through the firing port, Brenner caught glimpses of American soldiers moving with purpose and confidence. They wore uniforms that appeared almost casual compared to German military dress, but their movements showed professional competence. One man carried what Brenner now recognized as the weapon that had destroyed his squad, the automatic rifle that American infantry apparently deployed at the squad level. German squads had one machine gun team. Americans seemed to have automatic weapons distributed throughout their infantry. The implications of this observation would have been strategically significant if Brenner had been in any position to report it. American firepower was not concentrated in specialized weapon teams, but spread across entire units, giving them flexibility and redundancy that German organization lacked. Every American squad was a miniature fire base, capable of sustained automatic fire from multiple positions. This represented a fundamental difference in infantry doctrine, one that German tactical training had failed to recognize. A voice called out in accented but comprehensible German. "Soldiers in the bunker, you have 30 seconds to surrender. Throw out your weapons and come out with hands raised. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention. 30 seconds." The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, offering terms with neither threat nor pleading, just a simple business transaction being proposed. Brenner looked at his dying men, at the blood pooling on the concrete floor, at the empty shell casings that represented their futile resistance. His entire squad had been effectively destroyed in less than 10 seconds of actual combat. Everything he had believed about defensive warfare, about German tactical superiority, about the weakness of American soldiers, had been demolished as thoroughly as his squad. 20 seconds, the American voice called. Brenner made his decision. He carefully laid his rifle on the floor, raised his hands above his head, and moved toward the bunker entrance. Behind him, Stein made one final gurgling breath and went silent. 7 men dead, 1 critically wounded, and himself about to surrender. The impregnable bunker had become a mausoleum in the time it takes to brew coffee. The heavy steel door required both hands to open, and Brenner moved slowly and deliberately, knowing that nervous American soldiers might fire at sudden movements. The door swung outward with a groan of protesting hinges, and morning light flooded into the dark interior. Brenner stepped out, hands high, blinking in the brightness after the bunker's dimness. 6 American soldiers had weapons trained on him, their rifles and that devastating automatic weapon all pointed at his chest. Behind them, Brenner could see more soldiers, perhaps 20 in total, spread through the forest in professional defensive positions. A Sherman tank sat 50 meters back, its main gun depressed and aimed directly at the bunker entrance. The Americans had brought overwhelming force to ensure success, leaving nothing to chance. A sergeant approached, his rifle lowered but ready. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a weathered face that suggested combat experience. He gestured for Brenner to turn around, and hands quickly patted him down, removing his sidearm, his combat knife, and the photograph of his brother. The sergeant glanced at the photograph, then handed it back to Brenner, a small gesture of humanity amid the violence. "How many inside?" the sergeant asked in his accented German. His throat was dry, and his first attempt to speak produced only a croak. He swallowed and tried again. 7 dead. 1 wounded, maybe dead now. The sergeant's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He turned and called to a soldier who carried medical insignia. "Doc, we got wounded inside." The medic moved forward immediately, entering the bunker without hesitation despite the carnage within. 2 American soldiers escorted Brenner away from the bunker to a collection point where several other German prisoners sat under guard. The prisoners looked as shocked and defeated as Brenner felt. One man's uniform was scorched and torn, suggesting he had survived artillery fire. Another had a bandaged head wound, blood seeping through the dressing. All wore the same expression of men who had confronted something beyond their capacity to resist. Brenner sat heavily on the ground, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the attack drained away, leaving him hollow and shaking. An American soldier offered him a canteen, and Brenner drank deeply, the water cutting through the dust and smoke in his throat. The simple kindness of the gesture confused him. These were the same men who had just annihilated his squad, yet they offered water and returned personal photographs. The medic emerged from the bunker, shaking his head. The sergeant nodded and made notes on a small pad. 7 confirmed KIA, 1 died of wounds, he said to a lieutenant who had appeared. The lieutenant looked at Brenner with an expression that might have been sympathy. 1 survivor, the sergeant continued. He surrendered immediately upon call. The lieutenant nodded. Good, process him with the others. From his position at the collection point, Brenner watched as American infantry continued moving through the forest, clearing bunkers and defensive positions with systematic efficiency.
Smoke rose from multiple locations. The sounds of combat, both close and distant, created a continuous backdrop of violence. The entire defensive line was collapsing, not through dramatic breakthrough, but through methodical reduction of each position. A captain arrived at the collection point, accompanied by a soldier carrying what appeared to be intelligence documents. The captain spoke fluent German with a Berlin accent, and Brenner later learned he was a German Jewish emigrant who had fled in the 30s. The captain interviewed each prisoner briefly, recording unit designations, defensive strengths, and tactical dispositions. When he reached Brenner, his questions were pointed and professional. Your unit, your bunker's armament, your fields of fire. Brenner answered mechanically, no longer caring about security protocols. What did it matter now? The defensive line had failed. His squad was dead. The information he provided could not change what had already happened. The captain's expression shifted when Brenner described how his squad had been killed. 1 weapon, the captain repeated. A single automatic rifle through your firing port. Brenner nodded, knowing how implausible it sounded. The captain made extensive notes, then called over the sergeant who had accepted Brenner's surrender. "This is the bunker where Martinez used the bar through the aperture," he asked. The sergeant confirmed it. The captain looked at Brenner with something approaching respect. "You are very lucky to be alive." Over the following hours, as American forces consolidated their gains and moved forward, Brenner learned the full extent of the disaster. The entire defensive sector had been penetrated in under 3 hours. Bunkers that were supposed to hold for days had fallen in minutes. German casualties were approaching 70% in some units, with survivors either dead, wounded, or captured. The Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise through careful reconnaissance, coordinated assault, and overwhelming firepower. The weapon that had destroyed Brenner's squad was explained to him by an American intelligence officer who spoke excellent German. The Browning automatic rifle, the officer said, fires 30 caliber rounds at approximately 500 per minute. Much slower than your MG-42, but portable and reliable. Every American rifle squad has one, sometimes two. Your defenses were designed against frontal assault, not against soldiers who understand how to exploit angles and dead ground. The officer showed Brenner a technical manual with diagrams of the bar. The weapon was indeed a hybrid, combining rifle portability with automatic fire capability. It weighed roughly 9 kilograms when loaded, heavy for one man but manageable. Its effective range exceeded 500 meters, though the killing burst that destroyed Brenner's squad had occurred at under 150 meters, where accuracy and penetration were maximized. What haunted Brenner was the casualty mathematics. 7 men killed by approximately 40 rounds fired in one sustained burst. The efficiency was horrifying, representing a casualty rate that seemed to violate fundamental principles of combat. Military theorists had calculated that it required thousands of rounds to achieve a single casualty in typical infantry combat. Yet one American soldier with one weapon had achieved a 7-to-1 casualty ratio in 8 seconds. The technical explanation involved both ballistics and tragic circumstance. The firing port's design flaw, which existed only at specific angles, had channeled incoming rounds directly into the bunker interior. The concrete walls that should have protected had instead created a ricochet chamber that multiplied the lethality of each round. The bunker's interior layout had placed multiple soldiers in the path of both direct fire and ricochets. And the psychological factor of surprise had prevented any effective response during the critical seconds when survival might have been possible. As Brenner sat among other prisoners awaiting transport to POW camps, he reflected on the letters he had written to his brother. The confidence about warrior spirit overcoming mechanical advantages now seemed like the delusions of a child. Werner was still on the Eastern Front, still believing in German tactical superiority, still fighting with the confidence that Brenner had possessed just hours earlier. An American chaplain moved among the prisoners, offering comfort and cigarettes. He spoke to each man briefly, assessing their mental state and providing what pastoral care was possible in such circumstances. When he reached Brenner, the chaplain sat beside him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You have seen something that will stay with you," he said gently. "It is not weakness to be affected by such experiences." Brenner nodded, unable to articulate the collapse of his entire worldview. The chaplain continued, "This war has shown us that machines and production determine outcomes more than individual courage. Your soldiers fought bravely, but bravery cannot overcome industrial capacity. This is the tragedy of modern warfare. It reduces men to mathematics, transforms heroism into casualty statistics." The words offered no comfort, but their honesty was somehow more valuable than empty platitudes. As afternoon shadows lengthened, trucks arrived to transport prisoners to rear area camps. Brenner climbed into the truck bed with 24 other captured German soldiers, all wearing the same expression of shock and defeat. The truck rumbled through the forest, passing American supply columns moving forward with a seemingly endless stream of vehicles, ammunition, and equipment. The scale of American logistics was another revelation. Every few kilometers, organized supply dumps appeared, containing mountains of ammunition, fuel, and rations. American soldiers seemed to have unlimited everything, from cigarettes to ammunition to vehicles. Brenner's own unit had been rationed to 4 machine gun belts per day, while Americans apparently fired weapons until barrels overheated without concern for ammunition conservation. At the prisoner processing center, American efficiency continued to impress and depress in equal measure. Each prisoner was documented, photographed, searched again, and assigned a number. Medical personnel examined everyone, treating wounds with casual competence. Food was distributed, basic American rations that contained more calories than German frontline troops received. The contrast in national capacity was evident in every detail, from the quality of uniforms to the abundance of supplies. Brenner found himself in a holding pen with perhaps 200 other recently captured German soldiers. The men spoke in quiet voices, comparing experiences, trying to understand what had happened. Every story was similar. Overwhelming firepower, systematic assault, defensive positions rendered useless by American tactical competence and material superiority. The confident propaganda about weak American soldiers had collided with reality and shattered completely. A Feldwebel, a senior sergeant who had served since 1939, spoke with quiet authority. "We were taught that Americans could not fight without air support and artillery. Today, I watched them assault prepared positions with nothing but infantry weapons and destroy us. Everything we believed was wrong." The other soldiers nodded agreement. There was no anger, no defiance, only the numb acceptance of men who had witnessed the complete invalidation of their training and beliefs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.